Hello, my name is Gillian Warwick-Thompson and I am a trustee at DS Achieve, a Hertfordshire-based charity providing services for children with Down syndrome. I have a 14-year-old son with Down syndrome who has an education, health and care plan, an EHCP, and previously had a statement under the old legal regime. Since he started school, I've been providing voluntary support to other parents on the legal aspects of EHCPs via national and local charities. I'm also a law student, but not a solicitor, so this talk gives general information and does not constitute individual legal advice, which you need to seek from a qualified solicitor. This video aims to give parents and carers practical hints and tips on navigating the EHCP system for their child with Down syndrome. I'm not going to take you through the law in detail, as there's a vast amount of readily available information which you can access at the level of detail that you want. I am going to start with some signposting to resources of reliable information on EHCPs, covering the initial application, issuing of EHCPs, annual reviews and related issues. There are two national independent legal charities, IPSI and SOS-SEN, both of which have free helpline services for parents, paid for training opportunities and information on their websites. I've provided a couple of links in the slides to good starting points for reading more on the topic. The IPSI website is very comprehensive, and SOS-SEN includes the option to buy low-cost booklets on a variety of related topics. There are also some further high-quality free resources available. SEN Legal have a number of legal webinars on EHCPs, which can be accessed on their website and watched at any time. The Down Syndrome Association and Contact both have free helplines. The DSA is useful for condition-specific questions, and Contact can be particularly helpful with social care questions. Many local DS support groups also provide support and share local experiences on EHCPs, and every local authority in England must have a SENDIAS service offering free impartial information, advice and support. Just Google your local authority name and SENDIAS. The third place to find out about EHCPs is in the law itself. The Children and Families Act 2014 provides the legal framework and is the place to look to understand the legal obligations on local authorities, health bodies and education providers. Sitting underneath the Children and Families Act are the SEND regulations, which provide some of the detail on how the law must be implemented. For example, they set out the annual review processes and timelines. The SEND Code of Practice is statutory guidance, which means it must be followed unless the body concerned can show a better way to do the same thing. The Code of Practice is subordinate to the Children and Families Act and regulations, so will not override them if there's a conflict in what is written. Finally, there is case law, which provides interpretation on what the law means. The IPSI website includes a section on the most important case law. For example, those cases that explain what quantified and specified means in the context of an EHCP. Only upper tier tribunal cases create case law. Some barristers have also produced an overview document on lots of relevant case law called the Noddy Guide, which you can find on a web search. This all shows that there's a significant amount of information and guidance available to you as you get to grips with EHCPs. An EHCP is a legal document that sets out a child's education, health and social care needs and the provision that is required to meet those needs. It also includes the outcomes or differences that will result for the child arising from the provision that is made to support their needs. Before an EHCP is issued, a local authority must carry out an EHC needs assessment. There's no single answer as to when you should apply for an EHC needs assessment, but it's likely to be appropriate at some point between age 2 and 4. As a rule of thumb, it's sensible to ensure that it is in place no later than the child's nursery year, the academic year in which they turn 4. This will ensure that the transition into school is well planned, with everything in place to support them from the beginning of their reception year. Remember, it's a minimum of a 20-week process, assuming there are no problems along the way. So don't leave the application too late. And I've set out on the slide a process for working out the latest date to make your application. Remember, a child will only have an EHCP if they have a special educational need. So if their difficulties are solely health related, then they will have an individual healthcare plan or similar produced by the nursery or school instead. So, how can you prepare for making an application? The starting point is to consider the legal test for assessment, which is set out in the Children and Families Act. It's a two-part anticipatory test, not one where the conclusion of the assessment is known in advance. EHCPs are based on the evidence provided, so your first job is to start off with sourcing some of that evidence. The first part of the test for children with Down syndrome is straightforward. All children with Down syndrome will have special educational needs because they will need educational provision which is additional to or different from that provided to others of the same age. This is defined in the Children and Families Act, Section 21. A diagnosis letter from a medical professional will be sufficient to meet this test. Another resource which I found helpful is the Down Syndrome Developmental Journal, which includes developmental descriptors and gives you a picture of your child's strengths and weaknesses. It can provide useful evidence of the extent of delays in particular areas such as communication or gross motor skills, again providing evidence of special educational needs. The second part of the test is that the child may need an EHCP. At this point, the evidence does not need to show categorically that an EHCP will be needed. To help demonstrate that this part of the test is met, you can provide copies of existing reports that you will gather in the time before your child reaches the age for the application to be made. And I've listed some examples of professionals that are likely to be involved on the slide. Any clinic letters, individual educational plans, target sheets or advice reports will provide you with evidence. Showing that your child is already receiving special educational provision is helpful. The more relevant information you can provide, the better. The Code of Practice Chapter 9 covers EHCPs, and paragraph 9.14 suggests a range of evidence, for example, attainment, progress, nature of SEN, action already being taken, that a local authority might use to decide whether to assess, so it's worth reading that as a guide. When you have your evidence gathered, you can then make your application for assessment to the local authority. This can either be by letter, and both IPSI and SOS-SEN have model letters you can adapt and send to your local Director of Children's Services. Alternatively, you can use your local authority's own application form, which you can find on their local offer. This can be quite long and daunting, and you might not have all the information they were asking for, or not be quite sure how to complete them. So it's okay just to fill in the parts that you feel able to. It's a good idea to use the form if your nursery setting is working with you on the application, as you can then jointly make sure that all the information the local authority would want is readily available. Make sure that you take a copy of everything you send in, send it by recorded delivery if you're doing it by hard copy, and ask for confirmation of receipt. A final point to make here is that the vast majority of children with DS will need an EHCP, so they should be assessed. Occasionally, the local authority makes the wrong decision at the beginning, in which case you should appeal. I'll say a little more about appeals later. Once the local authority has agreed to assess, which must be within 6 weeks of the date you made the application, the assessment process starts. An important piece of law applies at this stage from the SEND regulations, Regulation 6, which sets out the information and advice that the local authority must obtain during the assessment. The information and advice must cover needs, that is the difficulties, provision, the input to support those difficulties, and outcomes, that's the difference to the child arising from the provision. The regulation lists all the people that information and advice must be obtained from, including parents, education, health, and social care professionals. Under Regulation 6.1d, information and advice must be obtained from an educational psychologist. This is a legal duty, so ensure that the local authority makes the appropriate referral. Regulation 6.1h is also important as it gives parents the right to request information and advice from specific professionals where the request is reasonable. It will usually be reasonable to request it where it relates to a known difficulty. So, for example, children with Down syndrome have speech, language and communication needs, and usually physical delay. So it would be reasonable to request information and advice from speech therapists, physiotherapists and occupational therapists. As an aside, the EHC needs assessment can be a useful way of accessing NHS services, as it's not uncommon for there to be long waiting lists for referral into therapy services, or a tendency to discharge as soon as a child makes a small amount of progress. This might be a reason for asking for an EHC needs assessment early, as professionals must provide their advice and information within 6 weeks of the request, which is a much shorter time than most health referral timescales. As with the need for therapy input, many children with Down syndrome will have vision and/or hearing difficulties, and therefore it's reasonable to ask for specialist vision and hearing impairment advisory teachers to be involved in the assessment. All local authorities must have sensory impairment advisors under their statutory duties. If you have any private professionals involved with your child, either directly or perhaps via a charity, then you can ask them to provide assessments and advice and submit them as part of your parental evidence. The local authority must treat them the same as all the other evidence, but sometimes there's a reluctance on their part to do so, particularly where the private professional has recommended a higher amount of provision than the NHS equivalent. It is worth noting that the SEND tribunal will weigh all evidence regardless of its origin and will often favour private specialist advice, particularly where that professional knows the child well. A final point on Regulation 6 is that you might want to make a separate parallel request for a social care assessment for your child, as sometimes the referral for advice and information does not get made properly or at all by the local authority. A common response from social care, where they are not already involved with the child, is a not known to service response, and this is unlawful. It does not meet the requirements to provide advice and information. Throughout the assessment process, the local authority must have regard to your views and wishes and feelings, support you to participate in the process, provide you with information and support you and your child to help them to achieve the best possible outcomes. This requirement is in the Children and Families Act Section 19 and is a useful piece of law to refer to if at any point in the process you feel you are not being listened to. After the assessment comes the decision either that no EHCP is needed or that one is needed, and in that case a draft will be issued for you to comment on. If the decision is not to issue an EHCP, the local authority must write formally to inform you of that and the reasons for the decision, and inform you of your rights to appeal the decision to the Senders Tribunal. The prospect of a formal legal appeal can be daunting, but there are sources of help and support. The tribunal is designed to be accessed by parents without legal representation and is cost-free. It's worth noting that for parents on a low income and without capital, it's possible to secure legal aid for an appeal to the tribunal. This will give you legal help, but not representation at the hearing, and provide funding for private reports if needed. Remember, the process is evidence-based. Success rates for parents at tribunal are high, so don't be deterred. As I said earlier, most children with Down syndrome need an EHCP, so the more likely decision at this stage is that an EHCP is needed and a draft will be sent to you. You have 15 calendar days to submit your comments on the draft. A useful way to check the draft is to go through the advice reports from the professionals and your own application and highlight in one colour all the educational difficulties or needs the child has and give them a number. All of these must be set out in section B, so check that there are none missing. Then go through the reports again and highlight all the recommended input, the provision, in a different colour and number them. Make sure that for each of the needs there is a corresponding provision in section F. A provision may cover more than one need. Then for each area of difficulty, there should be an outcome describing the difference that the provision will make. The correct way to think about the plan is first the difficulty in B, then the provision in F, leading to the outcome in E. For example, child A has difficulty with producing speech sounds, and the provision is that the speech therapist will provide a programme to be worked on by the school that includes an activity to practice speech production. And the outcome is that by the next annual review, child A will be able to make the first 10 sounds in the See and Learn Speech Sounds programme. Outcomes should be SMART, that is specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time-bound. Similarly, for any health or social care needs, they should be looked at in the same way and populated in sections C and G for health and D and H1/H2 for social care. Note that case law has deemed that therapies that educate or train a child belong in section F of the plan, not in section G. This is important as anything in section F sets out the educational provision which is required. It must be secured by the local authority and can be enforced against them, whereas in section G, it is only the health provision that is reasonably required, which is a lower standard, and the Health Commissioner has to agree to arranging the provision. You will often hear that an EHCP must be specified and quantified, and this is supported by the legislation and case law. It must be possible to read the EHCP and understand what support is needed, who will deliver it, when and how often, not only so that those implementing the provision know what they need to do, but also so that if it doesn't happen, you can enforce the EHCP against the local authority. To help with checking the EHCP, there are resources available from IPSI and SOS-SEN. When you send your comments on the draft to the local authority, they will also ask you what educational setting you want your child to attend. The law sets out your rights and the obligations on the local authority, and there's a very good explanation of these on the IPSI website. At week 20 of the process, the final EHCP will be issued. The local authorities are measured on meeting this target, so don't be surprised if the EHCP is finalised before you are entirely happy with it. Note that the local authority has the power to amend the EHCP at any time, so additions can still be made if there's a late report, for example. It's important to note that you have 60 days to make an appeal to SENDIST if you're not happy with the contents of the EHCP and or the nursery or school named. If you are not happy with the final EHCP, make a note of this date so that you don't miss the appeal window. Before finishing this video, I will briefly cover some common problems. First, remember, the EHCP is based on the evidence submitted. So if the evidence is of poor quality, then the EHCP will be too. You will be sent copies of the advice reports produced by the professionals, so read them carefully as they come in, and if something is missing or unclear, then you can ask the professionals to make changes. The Code of Practice, paragraph 9.51, is helpful here, as it states that evidence and advice submitted by those providing it should be clear, accessible, and specific. So if it does not meet this standard, it's reasonable for you to ask for it to be amended. Second, weasel words. Look out for wording such as may benefit from, regular, opportunities for, and ask for it to be changed to make it clear exactly what is needed. I would benefit from opportunities for a regular holiday in the sun, but I don't need it to support my difficulties. Thirdly, it's often difficult to get one-to-one support specified. Local authorities don't like it as it costs money, and they often argue it's not good for a child to be overly supported. However, in law, the local authority is not allowed to have a blanket policy that applies to all children without exception. Provision must meet the child's needs, and as already mentioned, provision must be clearly quantified and specified. It may be necessary for your child to have individual support throughout the entire day from an adult trained in Makaton and Down syndrome, and if so, that is what must be specified. The local authority will, of course, want to see evidence from a professional that this is needed. Finally, if things go wrong, there are a number of routes to redress which I have highlighted on the slide. Which body you approach depends on what the issue is, and again, IPSI, has a helpful section on their website which can help you work out what next. Thank you for watching, and I hope this hints and tips video has been helpful.